Why am I so passionate about the Greeks? I don't think, I don't believe in what you might call Greek exceptionalism, you know what I mean? That I don't believe the Greeks were uniquely, genetically somehow greater than any other species, any more than the British were in the 19th century when we had an empire. It's just, for some reason, there was a period in history, and I say for some reason, you can actually try and think clearly and logically about what those reasons might be, when the spotlight, as it were, was just on this area of mainland Greece and the Peloponnese and the islands around it and Ionia, what we now call Asia Minor, Turkey, you know, and bits of North Africa. These people, they were trading together. The Phoenicians, who came from really near Tyre and the Holy Land, as we would now call it, Palestine area, they were the great traders, and they brought the alphabet. And the Greeks were the first people, as far as I can tell, who thought, let's try and be better than our parents. I know it sounds like a silly thing to say, but what I mean is they actually believed in progress. And there's no real evidence that anyone before them ever had. Indeed, they had evidence across the Mediterranean at the great Egyptian civilizations, which for 3,000 years basically didn't change. You're right, you could go into a temple and look round it, an Egyptian temple, and then go to another one and say, well, those two temples are more or less the same, and they would be 2,000 years apart. Now that to us is insane. I mean, you can't go to a house that's 100 years apart in Britain without being able to tell the difference between a 20th century house and a Victorian house, or a Victorian house and a Georgian house. It's obvious, but they had 1,000 years. This is the way we live. No reason to change. But the Greeks did feel a reason to change. And at the same time, their trade and things were settling down. The coastlines had settled, and that's a very important thing to remember. For a long time, the sea levels weren't stable, so you couldn't have a port. How can you have a port if you don't know that the sea level is going to rise up and flood it within 6 months? But once you suddenly noticed the sea levels were the same, you could have a port. You could suddenly start trading, talking with other people, communicating, and using this new gift of the Phoenicians, the alphabet. And all of these sort of things happened around about the same time, and there was enough peace and stability and ideas of thought and telling stories. I mean, all myths say, why are we here? Why do the mountains rumble? Why does lightning flash in the sky sometimes? And you know, when we were young as a species, we attributed such things to agencies. You know, there must be a figure who throws the lightning down, a lightning bolt. There's a god, like a god of lightning, and there's a god of sky and of rain, and one of earthquakes, and one of volcanoes, and one of all the things that we couldn't control. Why food burst out of the ground had a god behind it. All the things that, as I say, we couldn't say I did, were done by gods, and so we invented them. And then slowly, the Greeks began to understand more and more about how they could shape their own destinies, and how they didn't need to bow and sacrifice and apologize, and that the gods, if they did exist, must be like us, capricious, mean, unjust, jealous, wrathful, lustful, all the faults that we have, as well as the great qualities we have of courage and fortitude and pity and so on. And so with the Greeks, because they were written about so quickly, the poetry was created out of their myths, you have these stories that emerge that are like public dreams, that have this fantastic resonance. They tell us about ourselves in ways that are not preachy. It's not religious. It's not like religious parables. They don't say, this means you must behave like that. Some of them, of course, are like warnings. You know, Icarus flying too close to the sun and the wax of his wings melting and plummeting to his death. You know, you can see that as a classic warning of hot-headed youth not listening to sound advice from their elders. But they're not like that, the Greeks. You also admire Icarus. You know that the Greeks did. There's something glorious about trying to fly to the sun, even if it is doomed. It's wonderful. And the Greeks are full of that. I could go on forever, as you can probably tell, so I won't bore you too much. But I just say that I think it was really important for me to tell the stories but not try and explain them. I have my theories, and you as readers will have your theories about what that story means, or what it is, if you like. If you think of myth as being the stories of a kind of collective unconscious of a society and a culture, sort of trying out, rehearsing, playing with ideas, deep thoughts about themselves, we can all say they're doing this with this story and that with that story, or this speaks to something. You know, Freud did it, after all, famously with the story of Oedipus. He saw it as a Greek expression of something very profound that we feel about our parents and so on. And you can agree with that or disagree with it, but it's not for me, in telling the stories, to guide you to a particular interpretation. I think part of the pleasure of them is like going around an art gallery. You don't want someone telling you what a painting means. It means what it is. And you look at it, and yes, you can see in that painting, gosh, that to me, that painting is all about how pitiful we are compared to nature, or it tells us about how death is in the midst of even the youngest life, or whatever the painting seems to suggest to you. But the painting isn't limited to that. That's just what you're seeing in it at that time. And I think in these stories, you can either treat them as like a comic book superhero stories that are just adventures, because they work as that, like none other. Or you can say, gosh, I've been thinking about that story about Bellerophon flying up on his winged horse. And the more I think about it, the more it just says something to me, you know? And I hope that's what people will feel, because that's what I feel while writing them.